Hold on tight for the next hour. You're entering into a place, a zone called the alternative to the alternative media. It's a place, a special place where even truth seekers fear to tread.
All right, people, let's move like we've got a purpose.
Affirmative.
Okay, Greg Anthony here, and glad you're back on the Investigative Journal on this March 24th, 2017 day on our calendar. All week long I've been talking about how Islam is not a religion of tolerance, but of intolerance. Then I was talking about the similarities between Catholicism and Islam, as well as how way back in the 6th and 7th century, the Roman Catholic Church pushed along Islam, in fact, maybe created it. And with that, I've received a number of emails this week that I want to respond to that basically stated that I was picking on Islam, that I was being intolerant towards this peaceful religion, that I shouldn't criticize Muhammad, and etc., and that I wasn't being politically correct, that I was being a racist. I got one stating I'm a racist. And what I want to say is this. I'm an equal opportunity critic when it comes to Catholicism and Islam. And if you look at my shows over the last decade, you'll see that I've criticized the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, the Jesuits, way more than I have the religion of Islam. However, I can't overlook it anymore when we see what's going on in the world. And then when you make the connection between the Jesuits and ISIS and this immigration policy supported by the Vatican that's flooding Western civilization with Islamic terror, I can't overlook it anymore. So you have to look back at the similarities. Did Rome create Islam? And where is this hatred coming from towards anyone who disagrees with the Muslim faith? Now, that doesn't seem apparent here in America for one reason. They are instructed when their numbers are in the minority to kowtow to the majority opinions in a country, to basically get along with them, to basically do their work undercover. And once their numbers grow, they completely change. And you can see it in countries that are predominantly Muslim. Christianity isn't allowed. And you look at some of their tactics, it is fascist. It's not a country you want to live in if you believe in freedom. And it's my feeling that if their numbers are allowed to grow in Western civilization, and you can see it already happening in Europe, that's exactly the fate of Christians and Jews. They will be killed. They won't be able to practice their religion, just like they can't in predominantly Muslim countries. So, to my critics, I think we have to look at the roots of Islam, just like we looked at the roots of Catholicism. Catholicism is only a deception. It is a religion based, it's a hybrid based on Babylonian sun worship. And isn't it interesting that Islam is a religion based on moon worship? And it's important to understand what's happening today by going back and understanding the deceptions that happened in the past. Now, if you look at Catholicism, I grew up in it. I'm their biggest critic. I was programmed, I was brainwashed by their traditions, and I came out of that beast. And the only reason I did is because I went to Rome as a journalist and learned about them, having no intention. At the time, I was an atheist, to be honest with you. But learning about this beast close up, I started to delve into the spiritual side of it after looking at their political intrigue. And, if you just start out, they give you a lie. They say that Peter was the first pope. That's untrue. And when you see all of the deceptions all of the traditions, their deceptive manner of teaching people that they are the one true faith, that the Pope is actually Christ on earth. And we looked at that the other day regarding this crazy idea of papal infallibility that only began in 1870 with a maniacal Pope, Pope Pius IX, and the Jesuits, who were the strong arm behind this crazy idea that even the traditional Catholics didn't agree with prior to 1870. And when Bernard Hassler wrote a book about it called How the Pope Became Infallible, and urged Pope John Paul II in a letter to look at this policy and to realize that many in the church were against it. After his letter was sent to Pope John Paul II, he was killed 4 days later. Now, they said it was there wasn't much about it, not much research into it. And all it said is he died of natural causes. But I found it strange that he sent the letter to Pope John Paul II on July 28, 1980, and he died on June 28, 1980, and died on July 1st, 1980. So, we delve into every aspect of what's going on today with there's just another terrorist attack in London. And we're seeing, when I talk to my friends in London and in Rome, I find that they've even set up, they've allowed so many Muslims into their country that they live in little neighborhoods. They set up their own laws. People, Western civilization, the people that live in London can't even go, the police won't even go into these areas, and that's happening in France and Sweden. They won't even go into these areas, and they've set up their own courts. Then they send gangs out to harass women who may be wearing a skirt they don't agree with, or they don't like a guy having a cigarette in the park. And they're basically telling people that, it's either our way or the highway. So I started to look at this, and I got a couple good things to present today. And I wanted to look at Catholicism and Islam and the ties that bind. Now, there was a guy named T.A. McMahon who wrote an article on this, and I'm going to refer to it and then give some comments, and then I have a short clip to play regarding these similarities between Catholicism and Islam. And there goes Max, my horse. He's a dog masquerading as a horse, and he's actually having he's drinking some water this morning, and he loves to do this during my show. He waits till I get on the air, and then he comes in and decides to drink water, knowing I cannot stop him. But anyway, like I said before, it's quite soothing, because when I used to live on a farm, one of my greatest pleasures was to feed the horses and to listen to them eat and munch on hay and drink water. Very soothing, while you sit on a bale of hay. Okay, Max, that's enough. He's done drinking, and now he's going to sit patiently and listen. He's the most educated dog I know. And maybe he goes out and starts spreading this word, to all his dog friends. Listen, do you realize the secret societies? Do you realize what's going on behind the scenes? I wonder how many converts he's got. But anyway, let's get back to T.A. McMahon. And I wanted to go over a lot that he stated. And he said he wrote an article regarding this, got a lot of criticism, just like I did this week. And he even referred to, he was stating this, he said, what's the big deal? Why are evangelists, do even Protestants start talking against me? And I said to myself, it's because they are working, most of these Protestants now are working under the umbrella of Rome and will not say one bad thing about the Pope. And, when he looked at this, he said, Rome has been telling us about this common ground with Islam for decades, so what's the big deal? And he says, look at what the 1994 Vatican publication recognized. This is the title. Recognize the spiritual bonds which unite us. 16 years of Christian-Muslim dialogue. So he's saying, why should anybody be upset by simply repeating what the Roman Catholic Church and the Muslims have been doing for centuries. And he says this, actually, the real controversy stems from the confusion created by the Church of Rome. And let me quote him here. He says, in her zeal to be the spiritual voice of the world's religions, okay, let me just get back to this. To be the spiritual voice of the world's religion, she talks out of both sides of her ecumenical mouth regarding her relationship to Islam. Not only has she made to those of the Muslim faith some theological overtures, which contradict Christian orthodoxy, but even worse, there are ties to the two religions which go a lot deeper than most people realize. And then he says, let's start considering some of them. Now, for years I've been talking about it, and I've been looking all the way back to when Islam was started and the reasons behind it, so you can go back to some of my shows to get that. But he says, starting with a number of obvious things, look at this, folks. Catholicism and Islam each exceed 1 billion followers, they say, nearly all of whom enter their respective faiths as infants. He says more than 16 million babies are baptized into the Roman Catholic Church each year. It's a family thing, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. And how many others of you out there? I find people that really start understanding Catholicism come from it, because they're the ones on the front lines that have been brainwashed, that have been told all these things that aren't true. When you start really, and I can't even remember having a Bible in the house, only the Catholic Catechism. Now, he went on to say that his sisters and his family were baptized Catholics. His parents were Catholics. My parents were Catholics. Well, my one parent was Jewish, and my other was Catholic. And their siblings were baptized into the church because their parents were Catholics. That's the primary way the faith is propagated. Okay. Now, when you look at Islam, folks, I looked into this. Baptism isn't a part of it, I guess. All children that are born into Muslim families are considered Muslims just because they're born into it. Their official confirmation follows. As soon as they are able to confess Shahada, there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. You can't say anything against Muhammad, just like you can't say anything against the Pope. By getting kids early, so to speak, this has been a motivating factor in the Vatican and the Saudi-sponsored lobbies against UN endeavors to introduce contraceptives and other methods of population control, especially in third world countries. Now, the Vatican is always opposed to, on the surface, of contraception, birth control, etc., right? However, isn't it interesting that recently Pope Francis recently stated that he thinks that people shouldn't have as many babies because there's too many people in the world now? But he says that here in America. I wonder if he goes over to these third world countries and states that. Now, it can't be refuted, folks, that Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world today. Now, I remember back in the 70s when it was in vogue. Remember Muhammad Ali became Muslim, and then Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Lou Alcindor, the big basketball player. And wasn't it interesting that they were presenting Islam as this religion of interfaith, of accepting all? That goes into just the theories that we talk about here, is that when they're in a minority, they look for extremely important figures to start swaying minds that Islam is this tolerant religion. But my question is, when they grow in numbers, right, how come they're not so tolerant anymore? Look at what goes on in countries with 90% or more Muslim people living in it. You don't have any rights outside of what they tell you. Doesn't make sense to me. Now, Catholicism, again, can't be disputed that it's the largest religious body, least in numbers, they say, among these professing to be Christian. Now, we've talked many times on this show that people are confused. They consider Catholicism and Christianity to be one and the same. They're not. Christianity is much different than Catholicism. You have to make the distinction, and we're going to show you today a little bit. Now, if numbers were the only thing to choose a religion by, of course, people should either select Islam or Catholicism, right? But think about it. Mr. McMahon here made me think about this because he said, quote, however, the Bible has no such yardstick. Rather, Jesus said, wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in threat. Because strait is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. Just the opposite, right? He says it's narrow. The gate to truth, the gate to finding Christ, to finding eternal life is narrow, not widespread like Islam and Catholicism. So there is a subtle warning, isn't there? Even in the Bible. Maybe that's one reason they don't want you to read the Bible. I'm talking about the priests I grew up with. We had catechism classes. There was no Bible in there. We learned about how important Mother Mary was. And we used to pray to Mother Mary all the time, much more than we prayed to Jesus. And we look at this veneration and worship of Mary found among Roman Catholics, don't we? But not many know that much the same deference exists among Muslims. There's a chapter in the Quran is named Mary, Surah Maryam. And Mr. McMahon here, that I was just mentioning that, he reminds me to look, and he says this. He says, from the outskirts of Cairo to Bombay to Medjugorje, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, hundreds of thousands of the Islamic faith have congregated wherever processions carry her statues, and where her apparitions are said to have appeared. She is esteemed above the most revered women in the Muslim faith, including Muhammad's two favorite wives, Khadija and Aisha, and his daughter Fatima. What is this big Mother Mary apparition, in Fatima? It's the same name as Muhammad's daughter. The Hadith teaches that Muhammad selected Mary as his first wife upon entrance into paradise. You got to see this. And he says, for more about Mary and Islam, see Mary who? I guess you can Google that. One of the most popular Catholic apparitions of Mary is referred to, now think about this, as Our Lady of Fatima. And, we have to then look. One of the things I grew up with are all these Catholic prayers. And I remember, you go to confession, you go behind that, in that little box, you go, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. My last confession was blah, 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 blah. And you tell him your sins, and he says, well, I'll say 20 Hail Marys and 20 Our Fathers and 3 acts of contrition or whatever. So you're indoctrinated with all these prayers. And it's repetitive. And I would sit there. I remember, I was a young kid. And, when you're a young kid, you're susceptible to brainwashing. And I wanted to be close to God, but I'd sit there and go, why is he making me repeat the same prayer 20 times? I mean, it's driving me crazy in my mind. I'm going, can't I just go once and go times 10, which means 20 or whatever? 2 times. Can I just go once? 20 times I'd sit there. I'm thanking God he didn't give me 100. I never got out of that church. But have you ever realized that Catholic and Islamic prayers have many similarities? Now, Muslims pray to Allah 5 times a day. It's altogether an act of obedience. I can't believe that. I mean, you got to sit down. They got this little rug, and they face east, Okay. And the prayers, it's towards Mecca or something. And the prayers are always repetitive, just like the prayers are repetitive in Catholicism. And Mr. McMahon here reminds me, he brings a quote here from a Muslim, puts it this way, quote, it's hardly intimate communication with Allah. It's done more to escape the punishment due to those who neglect prayer. Now, that's the exact same way I felt. I'm going, how can I get closer to God? By repeating the same thing, and especially if I'm praying to Mother Mary. Now, most prayers... Oh, one other thing. If you go into Catholic homes, there's always a statue of Mother Mary somewhere. Somewhere you're going to find it. Okay, most prayers prayed by Catholics are also as repetitive as I just gave you an example. Now, one other thing you got to remember. This rosary they give you. I remember they give you a rosary and they said you got to pray the rosary every day. That to me was impossible because I was too busy playing baseball and sports and trying to study and whatever. And this rosary, they give you this with these beads, and then you got the cross there, and one bead, you go 10 little beads, then there's one big bead, and I used to get confused. Well, they tell you, when you're on the little beads, you say this prayer. When you get to the big bead, you'd say this, and then you go back, and then I go, well, holy, and this thing was never ending, I mean, there was a lot of those little beads. And I don't ever think, and I'll be honest with you, I should have said this at a confession. Bless me, Father, for I've sinned. I've never said the rosary fully through in my whole life. Can't do it. But I was too embarrassed to say that, so I'd lie. Oh, yes, I said the rosary this week. Okay. Now, that's the best example. Repeating 16 Our Fathers and 153 Hail Marys on the rosary is far from personal communication, I think. Furthermore, when a Catholic goes to confession, the rosary, folks, is the worst punishment you're ever going to get, or penance for one's sins. I was always going, oh my God, I'm not going to give him the worst thing I did this week because I'm not going to say that rosary before I leave that church. We'll be in there forever. And my mind always used to wander, even when they gave me 20 Our Fathers and 20 Hail Marys. By the time I was on number 3, I'd lose count. Then my mind would start wondering about anything, even algebra, that I hated. I would start thinking about that over the rosary and over these, the Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. I've said it so many times I can never forget it. But it's crazy. And, the rosary was the severest punishment, and I never got one. Thank God, I never would have gotten out of that church. But we have to understand that prayer beads are very important to Islamic devotion to Allah long before there was an apparition of the Blessed Mary taught, Now, Blessed Lady taught St. Dominic, supposedly, to pray the rosary beads in the 13th century. We're talking about beads before that in the creation of Islam, 6th or 7th century. Prayer beads are a stock item in ancient and modern paganism as well. There's a connection, right? Interesting. Let me make sure I don't run out of time here. I've got about a minute. So let me say this. Isn't that interesting, though, that prayer beads are very important in paganism? And Catholic Church historians credit the prayers, this is Mr. McMahon, we'll end with this and then come back in the second half, credits the prayers of members of the Confraternity of the Rosary to a major naval victory over the Turks, which saved Europe from the Mohammedan peril. Whatever the hell that means. Well, anyway, listen, interesting stuff. Boy, it's kind of like deprogramming at a late age, right? I'm deprogramming myself. It may be helping to program some of the other Catholics who aren't far along in is not as far along in their deprogramming as I may be. But anyway, we'll continue deprogramming ourselves. In the second half hour on the Investigative Journal.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
The following program is labeled dangerous and off limits by the supreme Jesuit command. But stand tall, people. Listen up, and you may just learn something.
Oh, dear Lord Jesus, this ain't happening, man. This can't be happening, man. This ain't happening.
Okay, we're back for the second half hour, the investigative journal. And isn't this stuff interesting? I mean, talking about the similarities between these two huge religions at the heart of what's going on in the world today, where they come from, what they're really all about. And it really is kind of a learning experience, right? And much better than listening. I mean, if you're going to turn the TV on, or if you're going to go to the mainstream media, or even much of the alternative, all you're going to hear about is, healthcare reform, where everybody's going crazy with Trump and all of these political things, the Russian involvement in the elections, and how America is, how the NSA is spying on everybody. And now they're really concerned about it because there may be the NSA spying on Trump and his people, and now they're really getting to some really, and that stuff really, it gets old after a while, doesn't it? And this stuff is much more interesting because there's really gives you a basis of what's really happening in the world today, right? So we left off with these prayers, these beads and rosaries that they're given to you, and the similarities between many other things. And that's what we're going to start with today. This second half hour, pilgrimages is interesting. But let me preface it by saying, why am I doing this? Well, the reason is I believe that first, Rome had a very strong hand in creating Islam to destroy Christianity way back in the 6th and 7th centuries in North Africa and in other places. And I have a belief that they're doing the same thing today. And you can't understand what's happening in the Islamic religion, what's happening around the world with immigration, unless you understand what this is all about. Now, if we look back, we did look back, and then I got criticism from many people this week because of this, and stating that I was being racist by talking about the great Islamic tolerance. Look at all the tolerant Muslims there are. But let me tell you this. If we look back at the history of our country, how Catholicism was persona non grata back in the beginning stages of this country, there Catholics couldn't hold office. They didn't want a Jesuit in this country because of what they were doing in Europe and how they wanted to overthrow even Parliament. But that's all forgotten now, because Catholicism is supposed to be a very, very inclusive religion, and spreading their wings to everyone in this ecumenical movement. But really their goal is to, as their numbers increase, you're finding that even Christianity is being persecuted in this country, and we bring to you the Alamo ministry story to prove that. And you can go back to many of my shows that ask the main question: why would they persecute this ministry by claiming their pastor committed sexual abuse and child abuse when he didn't, when in fact there's thousands and thousands of priests that have really done a number on people, right, and children, but they don't close down any Catholic churches. They don't close down and force, they don't just, tell students not to go to St. Mary's parochial school when there's 5 or 6 priests there committing sexual abuse. But what they do is they frame a pastor. They destroy a Christian community because they don't follow the Pope, and they're not afraid to talk about the Vatican the way I do. And then they take their children, and now they're taking their property. It shows you there's a double standard. And that same thing, if you move further, why are they allowing radical Islam to function in this country through the Fethullah Gulen movement that we've talked about? Check his name out. And also allow even these radical groups to exist. And we pointed out Islamburg in northern New York, in upstate New York, where there's a compound there, at least on 60 acres. And they got even pictures and videos of them walking with weapons saying death to America. Why aren't they kicked out? So I see, that's why we're doing this, because there is a connection between these two religions and what they're really all about, way, way back. And so the interesting thing I always thought was these pilgrimages. Now, both Catholics and Muslims regard them as ways of obtaining favor from God, right? And in the Hajj, it's H-A-D-J, one of the 5 pillars of Islam, is a required one-time journey to Mecca every year. Now, for Catholics, these acts of they're considered acts of religious purification, and often induced by promises of indulgences, promises that if you go there, we'll say prayers for the dead, we'll get people out of purgatory, all these things that are non-biblical. And multi-millions of Catholics travel yearly to these shrines dedicated to Mary, and she's always in a cave, I guess. And that's kind of what the pagans used to worship, in caves, right? Remember the Crusades? I'm going to refer to Mr. McMahon here, who refreshes my memory. He says the Crusades were indulgence-stimulated attempts to regain Jerusalem from the infidel Muslims in order to reestablish Catholic pilgrimages. Incidentally, he says, the Church of Rome offered the Crusaders full pardon from purgatory. That's that thing where you die and then you sit in this place before you go to heaven or hell, should they die trying to liberate the Holy Land. Similarly, Islam offers rewards in an assurance of paradise to those who die in religious battles, jihad, including suicide bombings. So they're allowed, that's the ultimate of brainwashing. You wonder why these guys pack their body with explosives, because they're offered paradise if they kill heretics or they kill believers of Allah, and they're going to go and spend time with the virgins up in paradise. Now, did you know that Roman Catholicism recognizes Allah as the God of the Bible? Now, why? Listen to what Mr. McMahon says here, and I remember referring to this once before myself. In 1985, John Paul II declared to an enraptured audience of thousands of Muslim youths, Christians and Muslims, "We have many things in common as believers and as human beings." So what he's saying is that Muslims and Christians are the true believers, Muslims and Catholics. And he says, we believe in the same God, the one and only God, the living God. But I ask you, how's that possible? Historically, Allah was a pagan idol, supreme among many idols worshipped by Muhammad's Quraysh tribe long before he was born. Now, Will Durant, in his classic, The Story of Civilization, writes this. Now listen to this. Within the Kaaba, in pre-Muslim days, were several idols representing gods. One was called Allah. 3 others were Allah's daughters, Al-Uzza, Al-Lat, and Al-Manat. We may judge the antiquity of this Arab pantheon from the mention of Al-Lat by Herodotus, 5th century BC Greek historian, as a major Arab deity. The Quraysh paved the way for monotheism by worshiping Allah as the chief god. So we've talked many times about the pagan roots and this meshing of Babylonian paganism and Catholicism. But here's the same pagan roots we're identifying in Islam. Mr. Durant goes on to say, archaeological evidence uncovered in Arabia is overwhelming in demonstrating that the dominant pre-Islamic religion, and I'm going to add this, before the Vatican got their dirty hands on deciding to create an enemy and create this religion, the dominant pre-Islamic religion was the worship of the moon god, Allah. So we have Vatican, this yin-yang thing going on here, right? We have the Vatican, which is a hybrid of sun worship, and now we have Islam, which is a hybrid of moon worship, yin-yang, right? The moon god Allah. Muhammad simply eliminated the other 300-some deities, including Allah's daughters, making Allah supreme while retaining many of the pagan rituals and symbols associated with him. Seems to be similar to what Catholicism did, right? For example, Mr. Durant points out in that book he wrote, The Story of Civilization. For example, the crescent moon was the symbol of the moon god from the time of Sumerians and the Babylonians through the time of Christ, and right up until Muhammad's arrival. It's hardly a coincidence that the Ramadan, the Muslim time of fasting, begins and ends at the time of the crescent moon. Nearly all of the moon god rituals and other idolatrous practices, including kissing the black stone, praying toward Mecca, running around the temple and between the 2 hills of Safa and Marwa, were pre-Islamic rituals. Now, he goes on to say, Catholicism's zeal to relate to Islam makes one wonder how honest it is about its own perspective on God, based on the sacred scripture. God is referred to as Yahweh or Jehovah about 9,000 times in the Bible. Never is he thus referred to in the Quran. He reveals himself in the scriptures as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is the father of the Jews, the God of Israel. In the Quran, Allah never refers to himself that way. God calls the Jews his chosen people. He gave them the land of Israel as a heritage forever, and they shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt, and they shall dwell there, even they, and their children, and their children's children forever. And that's in Ezekiel 37:25. And God's covenant is with Isaac, Genesis 17:19 through 21, while Muslims believe Allah's covenant is with Ishmael. Allah has a completely different attitude toward the Jews than does the God of the Bible. Allah commands the followers to, 1, this is in the Surah 5:51, take not the Jews for friends. While the Jews are referred to in the Quran as, quote, the people of the book, the Bible, if they refuse to convert to Islam, they must pay a tribute tax to their overlords and become subservient to them. Now that doesn't sound like too much of a intolerant religion. Now how come you didn't hear that from these high-ranking Muslims that, like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and even Muhammad Ali, although I loved Ali for many things, this never has been a tolerant religion. Now, they say in their book, fight against such of those who have been given the scripture as believe not in Allah nor the last day, and forbid not what which Allah hath forbidden by his messenger, and follow not the religion of truth, until they pay tribute readily, being brought low, and that's in Surah 9:29. According to the Hadith, which most Muslims regard to be nearly as authoritative as the Quran, Muhammad is quoted as saying, quote, the last hour will not come before the Muslims fight the Jews, and the Muslims kill them. Again, the Hadith says that related to the Day of Judgment, Muslims will fight and kill Jews who will hide behind trees and say, quote, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, here is a Jew hiding behind me. Come here and kill him. Now, doesn't Catholicism also have the same long history of slaughtering Jews and even Christian Bible believers? There seems to be a lot of killing in both these religions, right? I don't think Catholicism is a tolerant religion. I don't think Islam is a tolerant religion. I believe at the core, both are intolerant, masquerading as something else. That's quite a statement, and one that you have to really think about. And on the surface, it sounds absurd to those who don't research the subject. But while it's obvious that there's clear differences between the biblical God and Allah, isn't it interesting that the Roman Catholic Church, even back in 85 when John Paul said this, accepts them as one and the same God? It's impossible. And the following is a quote from Vatican II. Listen to what it says. The Church has also a high regard for the Muslims. They worship God, who is one, living and subsistent, merciful and almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, who has also spoken to men. They strive to submit themselves without reserve to the hidden decrees of God, just as Abraham submitted himself to God's plan, to whose faith Muslims eagerly link their own. That's insane. What? It's not if you don't read the Bible. Or if, in the old days, what did Catholicism want to do? What did the Vatican want to do? They wanted to get rid of the Bible. They wanted to kill all Bible believers. And what did they do? They created another book in the Quran that does the exact same thing now. And so you have the similarities between these two pagan-grown religions masquerading as something else, as if they have the gall to say that the God in the Bible is the same as Allah. And the Vatican admits that. They're pushing this. Now, they went on to say, although not acknowledging him as God, they venerate Jesus as a prophet. His Virgin Mary they also honor, and even at times devote evoke. Further, they await the day of judgment and reward of God following the resurrection of the dead. For this reason, they highly esteem an upright life and worship God, especially by way of prayers, aims, deeds, and fasting. That was in Vatican II. Now, how crazy is that? in the Quran, Jesus is nothing more than a prophet on the same level as Muhammad. Now and then they say they also honor the Virgin Mary. Now, it's been if you look at Catholicism, it's long known that they have tried to delegitimize Jesus and raise up Mary as even being more important. So they've always been doing this. Similarities again. Now, Mr. McMahon then says this, and I'll quote him here. Carefully consider the above quote, taken from the Roman Catholic Church, claims is an infallible council. That's what that was. Now, we talked about the rule of, and I'm saying this, we talked about this crazy idea of infallibility that only started under a maniacal pope in 1870. And you realize, though, Mr. McMahon, thanks for adding this, you realize, he says, what truly binds Catholicism and Islam together. They both have a Jesus who cannot save their souls. The Quran teaches that Jesus did not die on the cross. And because of the Jews saying, we slew the Messiah Jesus, son of Mary, Allah's messenger, they slew him, not crucified, but it appeared so unto them, and lo, those who disagree concerning it are in doubt thereof. They have no knowledge thereof, save pursuit of a conjecture. They slew him not for certain, and that's in the Surah 4:157. The Vatican II may give Muslims credit for venerating Jesus, but in fact, it's a bogus Jesus, right? Sadly, Catholicism also has a false Christ. It teaches his death on the cross was not sufficient for our salvation. Not only must his sacrifice, which according to the scriptures was offered only once to take away our sins completely, and that's in Hebrews 9:28, be represented as a daily sacrifice for sins on altars around the world, but Catholics must get rid of their own sins through sufferings here on earth and in purgatory, and they must do good deeds, and they have a man who's now masquerading as vicar of Christ. It's not biblical. It's the same thing, just in a different form that's going on in the Quran. And finally, the Vatican II spells out clearly what Islam and Catholicism regard as their hope for salvation. They highly esteem an upright life and worship of God, especially by worries of prayer, rosaries, all that stuff, aims, deeds, and fasting. This is a salvation by works, not by not by faith, not by grace. And Mr. McMahon points out, in Islam, a person is accountable for every thought, word, and deed. His or her life is to be lived according to what is pleasing to Allah. Now, if it's pleasing to Allah to kill Christians and Jews, and they're taught this, what do you think they're going to do? And that's found in the Quran, the supposed tolerant book, and in the Hadith. In addition, there is a Sharia, which is the body of rules that attempts to cover the totality of Islamic religious, political, social, and domestic life. Breaking such laws involves various forms of temporal punishment. At the last judgment, Allah will determine one's eternal destiny as he places one's God and evil works on the divine scale. Quote, then those whose scales are heavily with good deeds, they are successful, and those whose scales are light are those whose souls will be lost in hell abiding. Surah 23, 102, 103. And the Hadith then goes into vividly talk about the tortures of hell. Now, what is the key to this? Got about 4 minutes. So we've heard a lot about Sharia law, and a lot of these little neighborhoods now functioning under Sharia law in London, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Sweden, in Norway, and what they're doing is they're disregarding anything that has to do with the laws of the country they're living in. And why? Because they have been brainwashed into believing that Allah supports Sharia, and if you do what Allah says, then you'll go to heaven. And so that way they justify killing any Christian or Jew because that's what it says in the book. But if you look closely in the Quran and in the Hadith and all of these, in the surahs, you will see that they're also instructed to act differently if they're not in the majority. They're told to act stealthily. And that, I believe, comes from exactly with the deceptions of Catholicism way back when. So that's why people they have the misconstruction. Even people that, there's many people in Catholicism who have no idea what Catholicism is all about. They blindly go around listening to it because they were born into it. And I believe many Muslims in this country are the same way. But they will not realize that if they don't conform, once the numbers of Muslims grow, and they don't follow Sharia, they also will be killed. So this is the basis of what's going on right now. This is the whole story, a little bit of the story behind the scenes of why you're hearing all these words: Sharia law, immigration of Muslims, this struggle between whether it's tolerant or intolerant. So I believe if you understand this stuff, if you really begin to look into the past, which they don't want you to do, even many Muslims who I've looked for some, and some have even contacted me, who've left and become born-again Christians, who really understand what the Quran and the Hadith is all about. But they never seem to get any kind of airtime on the mainstream. They don't get any, there's the political figures, and even the Democratic, Muslim political figures in the Democratic Party, even the mayor of London, they consider Islam to be a tolerant religion. I believe they're lying to you. And you have to understand what's really going on behind the scenes if you want to have any kind of intelligent conversation regarding this subject of what's going on in America, of what's going on in Europe, of this fight against supposed ISIS and who's behind it. The Vatican and the Jesuit fingerprints are all over what I'm talking about here. And it's about time people start looking at it. Have a good weekend. See you next week on the Investigative Journal.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.